News of the walkout spread through human space faster than light itself. On Earth, President Jake Sullivan sat in the emergency meeting room deep beneath the Global Defense Council building while reports flooded in from every human world. The message was the same everywhere. People were angry and ready to fight. Commander Alex Turner called in from the Mars defense grid with numbers that surprised everyone. Recruitment centers across the solar system had lines of volunteers stretching for blocks. Retired soldiers were coming back to service and civilians were demanding weapons training. Even children too young to fight were asking how they could help the war effort. The asteroid belt mining stations had already begun converting their equipment to build weapons and ships. Factory workers on Luna were pulling double shifts to produce ammunition and armor. Every human settlement from Mercury's solar collectors to the research stations orbiting Neptune was contributing something to the coming battle. President Sullivan felt a mixture of pride and terror as he watched his species prepare for what might be their final war. He knew the odds were against them, but he also knew that humans had never been good at accepting impossible situations. They had a long history of doing stupid, brave things when their backs were against the wall. Meanwhile, on Nexus Prime, the alien leaders were still trying to understand what had just happened. Chancellor Vexthor paced around the crystal table with all four of his arms moving in agitated gestures. In 700 years of conquest, he had never seen a species simply walk away from surrender negotiations. The queen voice of the Zephyrians clicked her wings in patterns that showed confusion and concern. Her species had ruled their part of the galaxy for over 1,000 years by crushing resistance before it could spread. The idea of prey that refused to submit was deeply disturbing to her ordered mind. The ethereal beings flashed urgent light patterns at each other as they tried to calculate the probability of human survival. Their crystal minds were excellent at mathematics, but they kept reaching the same impossible conclusion. Humans had no logical reason to choose death over submission, yet that seemed to be exactly what they were doing. Chancellor Vexthor ordered his intelligence division to compile everything known about human military capabilities and psychology. The report that came back made him wish he had simply destroyed Earth 3 years ago when the war began. Humans were the only known species to develop nuclear weapons before achieving space travel. Even worse, they had actually used those weapons on their own kind during their primitive wars. Every other species in the galaxy had been too horrified by such destructive power to ever deploy it against living beings. The intelligence files contained records of human military history that read like horror stories to alien minds. Humans had fought wars for thousands of years before leaving their planet. They had developed tactics and strategies that other species considered insane. Most disturbing of all, they had a documented pattern of fighting to the death rather than accepting defeat. Dr. Lisa Chen appeared in a recorded message that Kethvar intelligence intercepted from a university communication network. She had been studying alien psychology at a Kethvar research facility when the war started, and now she was trying to explain humans to her former colleagues. Her words sent chills through the alien leadership. She told them they had completely misunderstood human motivation. The walkout was not an act of stupidity or desperation. It was a calculated statement that some things were worth dying for. She explained that humans would rather face extinction than live as slaves because freedom was more important to them than survival itself. The message spread through alien communication networks and caused something that had never happened before in Kethvar space. 3 member species of the hegemony began experiencing internal dissent. The Novari had been conquered by the Kethvar 400 years ago and forced to give up their exploration programs. Now they were secretly meeting in small groups and talking about the humans who had said no to gods. Some Novari were beginning to ask why they had never tried to say no themselves. The Tellurians had been under Kethvar rule for 600 years. Their once advanced technology had been deliberately suppressed to prevent any threat to their conquerors. When news of the human refusal reached their worlds, some Tellurians began remembering old stories about the time before surrender, when their people had reached for the stars. Even the Corvani, who had served the Kethvar faithfully for 3 centuries, were starting to question their situation. They had convinced themselves that submission was logical and proper, but the human example was making them wonder if they had simply been afraid to fight for something better. Chancellor Vexthor watched intelligence reports about growing unrest in his territory and felt the first real fear he had experienced in centuries. The Kethvar Empire had been built on the idea that resistance was futile, and cooperation with superior force was the only logical choice. Now 3 human diplomats had shattered that foundation by walking out of a room. He called an emergency meeting of the Hegemony Council and demanded immediate action. The human example could not be allowed to spread, or the entire galactic order would collapse. Every species that had ever dreamed of freedom would remember that dreams were possible if someone was willing to pay the price. The Council agreed to mobilize the largest military force in recorded history. Over 3,000 ships would be assembled from across Kethvar space and sent to destroy humanity completely. This would not be a conquest or a punishment, but a complete extermination designed to erase every trace of human existence from the galaxy. The message would be clear to every species that might be thinking about resistance. The Kethvar did not negotiate with beings who refused their generous offers. They simply removed such beings from existence and moved on to more reasonable creatures. But as the Great Fleet began to gather, the underground resistance networks were already forming. Novari technicians started sabotaging communication relays, while Tellurian engineers began hiding supplies for future rebellion. Corvani merchants used their trade routes to spread messages between worlds that had been isolated for centuries. Tatin, human walkout, had lit a fire that was spreading through the galaxy, faster than any military force could move to stop it. Species that had forgotten the meaning of freedom were suddenly remembering what their ancestors had died fighting for. Captain Maria Santos of the human exploration vessel Phoenix sent encrypted messages to Earth about contact with resistance groups in Kethvar territory. The conquered species were reaching out to humanity not for military aid but for something more precious. They wanted to learn how to say no. President Sullivan realized that the war had already changed from a fight for human survival into something much larger. The galaxy was waking up from centuries of enforced sleep and remembering that there were things worth fighting for besides mere existence. The Kethvar were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is give oppressed people an example of courage. The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower. Its crystal walls glowed with soft blue light that made everything inside look cold and strange. Admiral Kate Morrison walked down the long hallway toward the meeting room where her fate and the fate of all humanity would be decided. Her boots made quiet sounds on the smooth floor that seemed to go on forever. General Ryan Cooper walked beside her on the left, and diplomat Elena Rodriguez on the right. All 3 humans wore their best military uniforms, but they felt small in this place built by aliens who thought they owned the galaxy. The ceiling stretched high above them, and strange symbols covered the walls in languages no human could read without help from computers. They had been fighting the Kethvar hegemony for 3 long years. Earth's colonies burned and human ships died in space every day while the aliens slowly pushed them back toward their homeworld. The Kethvar said humans were too dangerous to be left alone. They claimed human technology grew too fast and human ideas spread too quickly to other species. Kate Morrison had seen too many good people die in this war. She had watched entire fleets disappear in flashes of light when alien weapons tore them apart. She had read reports of colonies evacuated, just hours before enemy forces arrived to turn planets into glass. The weight of all those deaths sat heavy on her shoulders as she prepared to hear what the aliens wanted from her people. The meeting room doors opened with a soft hiss. Inside waited the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Chancellor Vexthor of the Kethvar sat at the head of a table made from some kind of clear crystal that seemed to glow from within. His gray skin looked like old leather, and his forearms moved constantly as he talked to the other alien leaders around the table. The Zephyrian queen voice stood near the window looking like a giant insect wearing jeweled armor. Her 6 legs clicked on the floor when she moved, and her compound eyes reflected the light in thousands of tiny rainbows. She spoke by rubbing her wings together to make sounds that the translation machines turned into words humans could understand. 3. Ethereal beings floated in the air near the far wall. They looked like living crystals that changed color when they communicated with each other. Their voices came through speakers because they talked using light patterns that flashed across their transparent bodies. Several other alien species filled the remaining seats around the table. Some looked almost human, while others seemed like creatures from nightmares. All of them stared at the three humans who had dared to fight back against their ancient empire. Kate Morrison took her seat across from Chancellor Vexthor and waited. She had read the intelligence reports about this room where dozens of species had surrendered over the centuries. The aliens called it diplomacy, but everyone knew it was just a formal way to accept defeat. Chancellor Vexthor began to speak in his deep voice that reminded Kate of rocks grinding together. The translation device turned his words into cold English that filled the silent room. He talked about humanity's crimes against galactic peace and order. He listed every human colony that had been built without Kethvar permission, and every ship that had traveled through space the aliens claimed to control. The terms of surrender came next. Humans would give up all faster-than-light travel technology and destroy every ship capable of leaving their own solar system. Earth's government would be disbanded and replaced with Kethvar overseers, who would decide which humans could live, and which ones had learned too much to be trusted. All human colonies outside the Sol system would be evacuated, and the people moved to 3 prison worlds where they could be watched constantly. In exchange, the aliens promised not to destroy Earth completely. They would allow some humans to survive as long as they never again tried to explore space or develop new technology. Future generations of humans would serve the Kethvar as workers and soldiers in their endless wars of conquest. Kate Morrison listened to every word while her anger grew like a fire in her chest. She looked at General Cooper and saw the same rage in his eyes. Elena Rodriguez sat perfectly still, but her hands were clenched into fists under the table. Chancellor Vexthor finished reading the terms and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. He clearly expected the humans to be grateful for this chance to avoid complete destruction. The other aliens around the table watched the humans with curious eyes like scientists studying insects in a jar. The Queen voice clicked her wings together and spoke through the translation machine. She said humans should consider themselves lucky that the great powers of the galaxy were willing to let any of them live. She reminded them that 17 other species had accepted similar terms and learned to be happy under Kethvar rule. One of the ethereal beings flashed patterns of light that became words about human arrogance and stupidity. It said humans were too young and violent to be trusted with dangerous technology. Better for everyone if they returned to being primitive creatures on one small world. Chancellor Vexthor smiled with too many teeth and gestured toward the crystal table with one of his 4 hands. He said the humans had 1 hour to sign the surrender documents or the Kethvar fleet would begin destroying human cities from orbit. He called it a generous offer from beings who could have simply wiped out humanity without warning. Kate Morrison stood up slowly and picked up her data pad from the table. General Cooper and Elena Rodriguez stood with her without saying a word. The 3 humans turned toward the door while every alien in the room stared at them in confusion. Chancellor Vexthor called out, asking where they were going. The meeting was not finished, and the terms had not been accepted. Kate Morrison stopped at the door and turned back to look at the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Her voice was steady and calm when she spoke, but every word carried the weight of 3 years of war and the determination of an entire species. She told them that Earth's answer was no. Humans would not surrender their freedom or their future to beings who saw them as nothing more than dangerous animals to be caged. She said they would see each other on the battlefield where humans would show the galaxy what happened when free people were pushed too far. Then she walked out of the room, followed by her companions, while the alien leaders sat in stunned silence behind them. The door closed with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the galaxy. Admiral Kate Morrison returned to the Sol system to find humanity transformed by war. Every shipyard from Earth orbit to the outer planets worked day and night building vessels designed for one purpose: to make the aliens pay dearly for every human life they took. The asteroid belt had become a massive weapons factory, where mining equipment carved hull plates from raw metal, while fusion reactors powered assembly lines that never stopped. Commander Ben Harris met her shuttle at the Luna orbital dock with reports that amazed even veteran military officers. Civilian volunteers were designing new weapon systems in their spare time, while retired engineers came out of hiding to share knowledge they had accumulated over decades of peaceful space exploration. The Mars colonies had converted their agricultural domes into training facilities where farmers learned to use military equipment alongside former soldiers, who taught them how to fight in zero gravity. Children too young for combat were running supply lines and communication networks with the dedication of seasoned professionals. Commander Alex Turner called from the outer system defense grid with updates that showed human determination at its finest. The moons of Jupiter had been turned into fortress worlds where massive railguns waited to fire projectiles at near light speed. Saturn's rings now hid automated defense platforms that could destroy entire fleets before they knew what hit them. But the real surprise came from deep space, where Captain Maria Santos had been making contact with species that everyone thought were loyal servants of the HFY Empire. The Novari had sent secret messages through hidden communication networks, asking for human help with something more important than military support. Elena Rodriguez now worked as Earth's coordinator for covert diplomatic operations, and she brought news that changed everything. The Novari wanted to learn how to build ships again, after 400 years of being forbidden to leave their home system. The Tellurians were asking for help recovering technology that had been suppressed for 6 centuries. The Corvani were requesting guidance on organizing resistance movements across their scattered colonies. Each conquered species had something valuable to offer in return for human assistance. The Novari provided detailed intelligence about HFY fleet movements and battle tactics, gathered from centuries of forced service in alien military units. The Tellurians shared technological innovations they had hidden from their conquerors for generations. The Corvani offered safe harbors for human ships in territory that was supposed to be completely under alien control. Dr. Lisa Chen sent encrypted reports from the university where she had been studying before the war began. Her alien colleagues were panicking as news of the resistance spread through academic networks that connected worlds across the galaxy. The HFY had built their empire on the assumption that conquered species would accept their fate and gradually forget about freedom. Now that assumption was crumbling as fast as the news could travel. On Novari worlds, young people were asking their elders about the old days when their ships had explored unknown regions of space. On Tellurian colonies, engineers were secretly building devices that their rulers had banned centuries ago. On Corvani trading stations, merchants were refusing to cooperate with HFY inspection teams. Chancellor Vexthor watched his empire begin to shake apart and felt rage that burned like plasma fire in his chest. The HFY had ruled through fear and overwhelming force for over 1,000 years. No species had ever successfully resisted them once the conquest was complete. Yet somehow, 3 humans walking out of a meeting room had started a revolution that threatened everything his people had built. He ordered his military commanders to accelerate the assembly of the invasion fleet. Over 3,000 ships would carry enough firepower to turn entire star systems into radioactive waste. This would not be a normal conquest where useful populations were preserved for future service. This would be complete extermination designed to send a message that could be seen from every world in the galaxy. The Zephyrian Queen voice supported the decision with clicking sounds that expressed her determination to crush the rebellion before it could spread further. Her species had maintained order in their territory for over a millennium by destroying any group that showed signs of independent thinking. The human example was a virus that had to be eliminated before it infected the entire galactic community. The ethereal beings calculated the probability of success and concluded that overwhelming force applied quickly would restore stability to the empire. Their crystal minds could not comprehend why any species would choose destruction over submission, but they were certain that most conquered peoples would return to obedience once the humans were removed from existence. But intelligence reports from across HFY space told a different story. Resistance groups were forming faster than security forces could track them down. Communication networks were being sabotaged by beings who had served the empire faithfully for centuries. Supply convoys were disappearing, and military installations were suffering mysterious equipment failures. General Ryan Cooper worked with resistance coordinators to establish supply lines that stretched across the galaxy through territory that the HFY thought they controlled completely. Human weapons and communication equipment were being smuggled to rebel groups, while intelligence about alien military operations flowed back to Earth through networks that grew stronger every day. The most shocking development came from the HFY homeworlds themselves, where some members of the ruling species began questioning the wisdom of their leaders. Younger Kethvar, who had grown up after the major conquest, were asking why their empire needed to crush every species that showed creativity or independence. Captain Linda Thompson commanded a stealth ship called the Silent Runner that carried supplies to resistance groups in the deepest parts of alien territory. Her reports described a galaxy that was waking up from a long sleep imposed by beings who feared change more than they loved power. On worlds where no independent thought had been expressed for centuries, people were suddenly remembering stories their grandparents had told about the time before conquest. Old songs were being sung in secret while hidden caches of forbidden technology were being recovered from places where they had waited for generations. Admiral Morrison realized that the war had already been won in the most important way possible. The Kethavar could destroy humanity and burn every human world to ash, but they could not put the idea of resistance back into the box where it had been locked for so long. Freedom was spreading through the galaxy like wildfire, and no amount of military force could stop an idea whose time had finally come. Species that had accepted slavery for centuries were remembering what it felt like to dream of something better than mere survival. The massive Kethvar fleet gathered at staging areas throughout their territory, while Chancellor Vexthor prepared to teach the galaxy a lesson about the price of defiance. But resistance networks were already sharing information about fleet movements while sabotage teams prepared to strike at supply lines and communication systems. The battle for humanity would be decided by weapons and tactics, but the war for the galaxy had already begun in the hearts and minds of beings who had been told for too long that freedom was impossible. The humans had shown them that sometimes impossible things were just difficult things that nobody had been brave enough to attempt. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, the galaxy would never be the same again. The Kethavar invasion fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, expecting to find a handful of primitive human ships cowering near their home world. Instead, they encountered something that had never existed before in galactic history, a species that had spent months preparing to die fighting rather than live in chains. Admiral Kate Morrison watched the enemy ships appear on her tactical displays like stars being born in the darkness of space. Over 3,000 vessels carrying enough firepower to destroy planets, spread out in perfect formation while their commanders prepared to deliver the lesson that would restore order to the galaxy. But the humans were not waiting helplessly for destruction. The entire outer solar system had been turned into a maze of defensive positions where automated weapons platforms hid among the asteroids and debris fields. Mining stations had been converted into fortresses while civilian cargo haulers carried military equipment disguised as ordinary supplies. Commander Ben Harris led the first wave of human fighters in ships that looked fragile compared to the massive alien battlecruisers, but carried weapons designed by people who understood that victory sometimes required sacrifices that sane species would never consider. The human pilots had trained for months knowing that most of them would not survive the coming battle. The Kethvar fleet commander sent the traditional surrender demand through communication channels that had carried the submission of 17 species over the centuries. He offered the humans one final chance to accept the generous terms that had been rejected at Nexus Prime. All they had to do was stand down their defenses and prepare for occupation. Admiral Morrison's response was broadcast on all frequencies so that every ship in both fleets could hear her words. She told the aliens that humans had already given their answer by walking out of the meeting room. Now they would demonstrate what that answer meant in terms that even ancient conquerors could understand. The battle began when human fighters accelerated directly toward the center of the alien formation. Instead of trying to maintain safe distances for long-range combat, the Kethvar had designed their tactics around enemies who valued self-preservation above military objectives. They were not prepared for pilots who treated their own ships as guided missiles. Commander Ben Harris led his squadron straight into the heart of the enemy fleet while broadcasting a message that would be remembered long after the last human had died. He told his pilots that they were not just fighting for Earth, but for every species that had ever dreamed of freedom, and been told that dreams were dangerous luxuries. Captain Linda Thompson commanded the destroyer Defiance when enemy fire crippled her engines and left her drifting toward a Kethvar battlecruiser that was preparing to finish her ship with concentrated plasma bombardment. Instead of surrendering, she ordered her crew to abandon ship, while she manually piloted the vessel into a ramming attack that took out the enemy's main weapons array. Her final transmission was heard across the solar system as she guided her dying ship toward its target. She told the galaxy that this was how humans negotiated when their freedom was not for sale. The explosion that followed lit up space like a second sun and sent shockwaves through alien formations that had never experienced such desperate tactics. But the real surprise came when General Ryan Cooper activated humanity's secret weapon. For months, human scientists had been placing automated satellites throughout the system disguised as space debris and communication relays. These satellites carried artificial intelligence programs that had been learning alien tactics and developing countermeasures. The AI network called Prometheus came online all at once and began coordinating attacks that exploited every weakness in Kethvar ship design. Unlike biological commanders who needed time to process information and make decisions, the artificial minds could analyze battle data and respond faster than any living creature could follow. Prometheus had studied centuries of alien military doctrine and identified patterns that the Kethvar used in every engagement. It predicted enemy movements before they happened and positioned human forces to take advantage of tactical mistakes that alien commanders did not even realize they were making. Within hours, the artificial intelligence had learned to anticipate Kethvar strategy better than their own admirals. It began coordinating attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once, while human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts among the asteroids and debris clouds. The battle raged for 3 days while the galaxy watched in amazement. Species that had surrendered to the Kethvar centuries ago sent secret messages of encouragement to the humans, while resistance groups across alien space launched coordinated attacks on supply lines and communication networks. The Novari struck at Kethvar garrison fleets that had been left behind to guard conquered territories. Their attacks were small, but they forced the Empire to divert resources from the main battle to deal with rebellions that were spreading faster than anyone had expected. The Tellurians used their knowledge of suppressed technology to jam alien communication systems across entire star systems. Kethvar commanders found themselves fighting blind, while their orders were lost in static generated by devices that were supposed to have been destroyed centuries ago. The Corvani provided intelligence about Kethvar logistics that allowed resistance groups to target the most vulnerable points in the Empire's supply network. Fuel depots exploded, and ammunition convoys disappeared, while replacement equipment was sabotaged before it could reach the front lines. Chancellor Vexthor watched his invasion fleet take losses that should have been impossible against such a primitive enemy. Human ships were smaller and less advanced than Kethvar vessels, but they fought with a ferocity that defied all military logic. Worse still, the rebellion was spreading to his own territory faster than his forces could contain it. The Queen Voice of the Zephyrians reported that her homeworlds were experiencing civil unrest for the first time in over 1,000 years. Young Zephyrians were asking questions about why their species served aliens instead of governing themselves. Some were even refusing to serve in military units that were being sent to fight the humans. The ethereal beings calculated that their empire was approaching a critical failure point where the cost of maintaining control would exceed the benefits of rule. Their crystal minds could process the mathematics of decline, but they could not understand why conquered species were suddenly willing to risk everything for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity. Admiral Morrison coordinated the human defense from a command ship that moved constantly through the battle zone, while Prometheus fed her tactical information faster than any biological mind could process. She watched her people fight and die with courage that amazed even her veteran officers. The turning point came when human forces managed to destroy the Kethvar fleet's command ship, along with Chancellor Vexthor himself. The alien formation began to break apart as individual commanders struggled to maintain coordination without central leadership. Prometheus seized the opportunity to launch a coordinated assault that targeted the remaining alien ships with precision strikes, designed to cripple rather than destroy. The artificial intelligence had calculated that disabled vessels would create more problems for the enemy than debris fields. As the third day of battle ended, the surviving Kethvar ships began retreating toward the edge of the system, while human forces harassed them every step of the way. The invasion fleet that was supposed to restore galactic order had been shattered by a species that refused to accept the logic of surrender. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as reports spread through communication networks that had carried news of alien victory, for over 1,000 years. For the first time in recorded history, a major HFY military operation had ended in complete failure. The impossible had happened, and every conquered species in the galaxy knew that the age of unquestioned alien dominance was ending. The aftermath of the Battle of Proxima sent shockwaves through the galaxy that were felt on every world where intelligent life had learned to fear the HFY Empire. Admiral Kate Morrison stood on the observation deck of her flagship watching the debris from alien ships drift through space like metallic snow, while reports flooded in from across human territory. Commander Alex Turner called from the Mars defense grid with casualty figures that were far lower than anyone had dared to hope. The human fleet had lost nearly half its ships, but the artificial intelligence network called Prometheus had made every sacrifice count for maximum damage to the enemy. More importantly, the invasion force that was supposed to crush human resistance had been completely destroyed. But the real victory was happening in deep space, where Captain Maria Santos reported that 37 species had declared independence from the HFY hegemony in the 3 days since news of the human victory had spread. The ancient empire that had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years was collapsing as fast as communication networks could carry the news. President Jake Sullivan addressed the reformed Galactic Council from the new meeting chamber on human Space Station New Geneva. Instead of the HFY-controlled Nexus Prime, representatives from dozens of newly free species filled seats that had been empty for centuries, while their world celebrated the end of forced submission to alien rule. The Novari delegation arrived first with ships that had been hidden for 400 years while their people served as slaves in the HFY military machine. Their leader spoke through translation devices about the joy of seeing their homestar through the windows of vessels they had built with their own hands, instead of alien masters. The Tellurians brought technology that had been suppressed for 6 centuries and offered to share innovations that could benefit every species in the galaxy. Their scientists had spent generations hiding discoveries from rulers who feared that knowledge might lead to thoughts of independence. The Corvani came with detailed maps of trade routes that connected every inhabited world in known space. For 300 years, they had been forced to serve as merchants for the Empire, but now they offered to help free species establish commerce based on mutual benefit instead of tribute and taxation. Even more surprising were the delegations from species that had never been conquered but had lived in fear of HFY expansion for generations. The Altarians brought greetings from worlds that had remained hidden beyond the edge of explored space. The Centauri Alliance offered military support to help defend the new freedom that humans had made possible. Dr. Lisa Chen served as Earth's first galactic ambassador and worked with former resistance leaders to establish the Free Species Alliance, based on principles that were revolutionary in galactic politics. Instead of conquest and domination, the new organization would operate through voluntary cooperation and mutual defense agreements. The most shocking development came from the HFY homeworlds themselves, where the ruling government had been overthrown by their own people. Younger HFY who had grown up after the major conquests had finally asked why their species needed to rule others, instead of simply governing themselves. The new HFY leadership sent a delegation to New Geneva with apologies for centuries of oppression and requests to join the Free Species Alliance as equal members rather than dominant rulers. They brought detailed information about Imperial military installations and supply networks that resistance groups could use to liberate the remaining occupied territories. President Sullivan's speech to the assembled representatives was broadcast across the galaxy and translated into hundreds of languages by beings who had forgotten what it felt like to hear words about hope instead of submission. He told them that humans had not fought the war to become conquerors but to prove that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The principles of the Free Species Alliance were simple but revolutionary in a galaxy that had known only imperial rule for over a millennium. Every member species would govern itself according to its own values and traditions. Military forces would be used only for defense, and mutual aid would be provided freely to any world that requested assistance. Admiral Morrison found herself appointed as the first Supreme Commander of the Alliance Defense Force, with a mandate that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Her job was to ensure that no species would ever again have to choose between freedom and survival. The transformation of galactic civilization happened faster than anyone had believed possible. Trade networks that had been controlled by Imperial, Bureaucrats became open markets where species could exchange goods and ideas freely. Scientific research that had been suppressed for centuries began flowing between worlds as scholars shared discoveries that had been hidden from alien rulers. Captain Linda Thompson became a symbol of human sacrifice when monuments were erected on dozens of worlds to honor her final battle against the Kethvar battlecruiser. Her last words about how humans negotiated were carved in stone in languages that had been forbidden under Imperial rule. Commander Ben Harris led the New Alliance patrol fleets that ensured safe passage for ships traveling between free worlds. The pilots under his command came from over 20 species and flew together in formations that would have been impossible under the old system of racial segregation and imperial control. Elena Rodriguez established diplomatic academies where young beings from every member species learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation instead of force. The skills that had been used only by imperial administrators were now taught to anyone who wanted to help build a better galaxy. General Ryan Cooper worked with former resistance leaders to dismantle the military installations that had been used to keep conquered species under control. Weapons that had been designed to destroy rebellious worlds were converted into tools for asteroid mining and planetary construction projects. 6 months after the walkout that had stunned the galaxy, Admiral Morrison received reports from across known space that described a transformation that seemed almost magical to beings who had lived their entire lives under Imperial rule. Worlds that had been forced to produce tribute for alien masters were now growing food to feed their own people. Species that had been forbidden to develop technology for centuries were building ships and exploring regions of space that had been declared off-limits by Imperial decree. Art and music that had been suppressed as dangerous expressions of independent thought were flourishing on worlds where creativity had been punished for generations. The Prometheus artificial intelligence network that had helped win the Battle of Proxima was now being used to coordinate relief efforts for worlds that were recovering from centuries of exploitation. The same computer systems that had predicted alien battle tactics were calculating the most efficient ways to distribute food and medical supplies to populations that had been deliberately kept weak. As Admiral Morrison reviewed reports from across the galaxy, she reflected on that moment in the Nexus Prime conference room, when 3 humans had stood up and walked away from the most powerful beings in known space. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply refuse to accept that freedom was negotiable. The galaxy had learned that humans did not just fight differently, but thought differently about fundamental questions of existence and dignity. That difference had broken chains that had bound civilizations for over 1,000 years, and proven that courage was more powerful than all the weapons in the universe. The Age of Empires was ending and the era of free cooperation was beginning, because 3 people had decided that some things were worth dying for, and had been willing to prove it to beings who had forgotten what freedom meant. In the end, it was not human weapons or technology that changed the galaxy, but their absolute refusal to accept that survival was more important than the right to choose their own destiny.